Here is your Africa True Story. Human rights violation and forced evictions of Africa's indigenous tribes for capitalistic gains. Forced evictions are acts or omissions involving the coerced or involuntary displacements of individuals, groups, and communities from homes, lands, and common property resources that were occupied or depended upon, thus eliminating or limiting the ability of an individual, group, or community to reside or work in a particular dwelling, residence, or location without the provision of and access to appropriate forms of legal or other protection. Indigenous populations are a group of people whose culture and way of life and mode of production differ considerably from the dominant of society, whose culture depends on the access and rights to their traditional lands and the natural resources, and whose cultures are under threat. They suffer from discrimination as they are regarded as less developed and less advanced than other more dominant sectors of society, which often prevents them from being able to genuinely participate in deciding their own future and forms of development. Across Africa, projects of capitalistic extraction still ensure eviction, mass exploitations of land, and misery. In 1913, Maasai communities went to the High Court of Britain, East Africa, because they were trying to stop the colonial government from evicting them from a large part of their land, which is today's Kenya. At that time, the colonialists wanted to pave way for white settlers to use the land for private capitalistic enterprise. Back then, in 1913, the Maasai were unsuccessful. Last year, a similar event took place where another court decision, this time around the East African Court of Justice, where Maasai communities sought redress against the renewed threat of eviction, put the Maasai in a position that their ancestors were in a whole century prior. The government of Tanzania wants to expand the space for luxury tourists to enjoy picturesque views of nature in Ngorongoro district, a kind of nature supposedly untouched by humans. In over 100 years, not much has changed in the basic constellation between Maasai pastoralists and their governments. Maasai are continuously forced to leave their lands through violent means. At recent demonstrations in the Ngorongoro region of Tanzania, dozens of Maasai protesters were severely injured while protecting their homes. What has changed, however, are the discourses through which governments justify the dispossessions of the indigenous communities from economic development to wildlife conservation. In 1913, development, modernization, and economic progress were central keywords to justify the dispossession of Maasai lands. Arguments such as these remain of central importance even today. For example, when people are being forced to leave their homes because of large-scale mining operations. People can lose their lands either directly or by forced evictions, such as in the recent example from the Karamoja region of northern Uganda or Senegal, or indirectly because their homelands become too toxic to live in, as in the case of communities around Lake Malawi. Here, justifying discourses are often not very sophisticated. One newspaper article reporting on Zimbabwean villagers about to be forcefully evicted from their homes to make way for a Chinese mining company ends with the iconic sentence. In a statement, the embassy said Chinese investors in Zimbabwe are working for the betterment of the country. In the case of East African Maasai communities fighting to remain on their lands in 2022, the vocabulary of land dispossession has shifted from economic development to wildlife conservation. Studies show that wildlife conservation has increasingly been used as an argument to evict indigenous communities from their homelands. This trend can be observed since the 1990s and is prevalent in all parts of the world. Another recent example from East Africa is the attempt of the Kenyan government to force over 20,000 members of the Ongek ethnic group from their ancestral lands in the Mau Forest on the ground that the forest constituted a reserved water catchment zone and the Kenyan state had to conserve. In mid of 2022, a South African court halted construction of Amazon's new African headquarters after some descendant of the Ko in the Sun, the country's earliest inhabitants, said the land it would be built on was sacred. The Western Cape Division of the High Court interdicted the project developer from continuing with works at the Cape Town site until there had been meaningful engagement and consultation with the affected indigenous people. The Khoi and the San were the earliest inhabitants of South Africa, the latter roaming as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, and the former joining them as pastoralists more than 2,000 years ago. In December of 2022, Shell agreed to pay $15.9 million in compensation to communities in Nigeria impacted by 4 oil spills that occurred from its pipelines in the Niger Delta between 2004 and 2007. The settlement will go towards the affected Ikot Ada Udo, Oruma and Goi communities, as well as the families of the 4 farmers that brought the case, as the communities were forced to leave their original homes due to the massive pollution caused by the oil giant. The Niger Delta, home to 6.5 million people, is one of the most polluted places on Earth, with oil spills bringing devastating impacts on the environment and surrounding communities. Africa needs to stand up now more than ever and protect its indigenous communities in order to preserve the continent's cultures and traditions. 100 years of colonialism and neo-colonialist practices cannot replace those that ensued ecological and economic resilience for thousands of years. Authorities must begin to restore, protect, and promote the land rights of local communities. Governments in Africa and beyond must show gratitude to communities such as the Maasai, Khoisan, Hadza, Karamoja, and many more who are famous for and have historically fortified swaths of the ancestral lands to uphold the conservation efforts. Therefore, it is only right that the communities are able to live peacefully and their rights to their ancestral lands protected and preserved. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, follow, share, and like our video. It's the best way of supporting us. And remember, Africa is watching.